I'm going to turn it over to Dave now, and he'll take it from here.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to see if I can get my slides up now. Chris, you can help me with this. Are they up?
Yeah, you're good, Dave.
Perfect. Okay, well, again, welcome here. Like I say, you can all hear me okay. As Chris said, if you want to keep your mics off, that really makes it bad when we get feedback there. So what we're going to do tonight, it's a bit of a review or an orientation or an introduction, whatever you'd like to call it. And as Chris Clark actually suggested that we have some level of education for the peace officers, so they might not be fighting the fires, though sometimes they are pretty hands-on, but it sure helps if they have an awareness of what's going on. This is a lesson we used to do every year, and then for the last 2 years we haven't because of COVID. And also when we did it in our hall, sometimes people would say, well, we do it every year, and sometimes we have a test, and so they do it every second year. Regardless, it's going to be a bit of a talking head. It's not that interactive, so it's going to be me talking through the slides. But we hope that's good information for you. And like I say, not terribly interactive. Welcome any questions. I'll try and keep it to about 90 minutes, and we'll take it from there. All right. So the first slide here is talk about the interface firefighter, and this is primarily wildland, but we're going to talk about the interface a little bit. And the interface is a little bit different than both structural firefighting and wildland firefighting. It's where you get a fire environment surrounding the houses where forested area comes in, and we may get a conflagration like Fort McMurray, where there's houses going up, or it may be like the fire we had in Hilo, where you've got individual structures are threatened. Now, when it comes to being an interface firefighter, in that interface, in that situation, it's uncommon to fight those structure fires to do an interior attack because it's not safe outside. So generally what we find is, because that's not the case, but because as an interface firefighter, you cannot avoid the wildland fire environment, is that our training concentrates a little bit more on wildland fire. So the idea is that structural fires get a good idea of wildland fire. And that's what we're going to cover tonight. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about describing wildland fire. So part of the importance of that is communication. Communication is always so important. So if we can describe what's going on so that we understand, so that people understand it and understand what we're seeing, that's going to help. We're going to talk about wildland fire behavior, how fire behaves. And we talk about the fire triangle. We also talk about the wildland fire behavior triangle. And essentially it's saying, oops, slides are not advancing. Is that right? Okay. Okay. Chris, if you want to speak up there so I can hear you, just let me know.
Yeah. So Dave, what we're seeing is the work mode. There we go. So we can see the interface firefighter now.
Okay. And when I put it to slideshow, now has it moved on?
No.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So now do you see the next slide?
Yeah, we can see the next slide now.
Okay.
Not in slideshow. You're still in the work mode, which will work.
Well, I think I'll have to do this then, yeah, because it's not doing it the way. But I think people can see that all right. The size is fine. So yeah.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so sorry about that. Just getting through this, but yeah. So we have. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to talk about describing wildland fire behavior triangle, which is the interaction between fuel and weather and topography, which determines how a fire behaves. And lastly, we're going to talk about wildland fire suppression, including a significant amount on safety. So when we describe wildfire, we largely do it by where and what is burning. And we have three types of fires generally. There's lots of different types, but generally we have ground fire, surface fire, and crown fire. And the first is ground fire. So that's when the fire is actually burning in the ground, not on the surface of the ground, but in the ground. We call that ground fire. And common in our part of the country is when that's peat moss, and you've got organic soils. And those are ones that may burn in the winter. The slide here we often call them hunter fires. So in November or December, hunters leave a campfire going, don't bother to put it out, and then it'll get a ground fire. So that's ground fire. The next is surface fire, and it's probably the most common and what you're most commonly familiar with. So surface fire is burning on the surface. And the most common fuel is grass. The most common is a surface fire going through grass. Speed or intensity, you can talk about it in meters per minute. So it might be 20 meters per minute or 10 meters per minute. And again, you can figure that out just like kind of a nurse when they take your pulse. If you watch how the fire advances for 15 seconds, and then multiply that by 4. But we also kind of go for some plain language. And we'll say, is the fire creeping or is it running? So that's just, that's just very clear, plain language to describe a surface fire, whether it's creeping or running. Now we get some more interesting, and the more, let's get your pulse going a bit more. We're talking about candling. And we're going to talk about crown fires. There's two types of crown fires. The first is candling or intermittent crown fire. Now what's distinct about candling or intermittent crown fire is that the fire is traveling vertically. It's going up the tree. So it's going from the surface up to the crowns. And with candling or intermittent crowning, it's an individual or a small group of trees that's going. It's not the whole forest that's going, because that would be a running or active or continuous crown fire. So when you have a running or active crown fire, it's more of a horizontal movement. It's going from crown to crown. And technically, it may be going along the surface and igniting the crowns as it goes, but the end result is the same. It's a horizontal movement of fire going across the crowns. And this is one of the most severe types of fire behavior, extreme fire behavior that we see. So I'm speaking about the severity of fire behavior. We sometimes hear people talk about head fire intensity or rank. So again, you don't need to, what we're going over tonight, you don't need to memorize all this or know all this. It's one of those things like a structural fire behavior. We will throw it at you and you'll get stuff and then you'll pick it up and we'll really press home the key points. But don't worry about memorizing this or knowing all of this. But you do hear head fire intensity or rank thrown around. So I can just explain that. It's a scale of 1 to 6. 1 being the most passive and 6, as in that photograph, would be the most extreme. Sometimes I find the best way to understand a scale like that is to look at the midpoint. So the midpoint, so when you're going from rank 3 to rank 4, what we would see is that we have a pretty intense surface fire and we're not catching it. So our typical firefighting with pump and hose or with backpack water pumps, that's the polite name, you're not able to keep up with that fire. And they also, that torching or candling is something that you will see when you're getting from rank 3 to 4. And it tells you something that you're not catching it, because then it becomes time to rethink our what we're doing. If we're getting from rank 3 into rank 4, because it is a distinct change when it's our ability to contain that fire. So we talked about describing fire. We talk about ground fire, which is in the fire, surface fire, which can be running or creeping. Talk about candling or intermittent crown fire, and we talk about running or active or continuous crown fire. So I was talking where we're finding the fire, ground, surface, or crowns, and then somewhat of the intensity. Okay, so next thing I'm going to talk about, and this slide, it's kind of funny because I hand-bombed this thing, just because normally when I do this presentation, I got a whiteboard and break it up a bit, and this would be on the whiteboard. Regardless, the parts of a wildland fire. And if you remember what I said when we started about describing fire, this is important when we're communicating, that we understand what we're saying to each other as far as on the radio or describing the fire behavior. It's important to know to use the same language. So our parts, when we look at the sides of a wildfire, we talk about the rear, the flank, and the head. So the rears, as it sounds, that's the back part. And then the flank would be the sides, and the head would be the business end. That's where it's most intense and spreading. And you can see we've got an arrow for the wind, because usually that's what's pushing these wildfires. And usually if we get extreme fire behavior, it is because its wind is pushed by the wind. So that gives us the parts. The rear is distinct because it's just backing fire. The flanks is not as direct, and the head is where it's most intense. Sometimes we'll get a finger, and the thing with a finger is, so that in this spot where it didn't burn, maybe it's wet, maybe there's no fuel there, maybe it went around a well site or a road or something, or maybe the where the finger took off, it was just more flammable, or there was slope involved. What we want to be careful of and cognizant of fingers is that if you're in between the finger and the head, you may not realize that you have fire on both sides. So it's important to realize that. It's not always just a clean fire. I think we saw the fire that we had, and we'll talk about the fire we had in Hilo and use that as an example recently. You can see that it's not necessarily regular. The area inside the fire we describe as the black. So the burned area we describe as the black. And that's important because we're going to talk about safety zones. And often the black is a very good safety zone if it's cleanly burned, especially like in a fuel like grass. Sometimes we refer outside as the green, but more common terminology is just the burnt as the black. And the last thing on here is a spot. So a spot fire, it's a small fire that's pushed out in front of the main fire. Two things about spot fires that are significant. One is that similar to a finger, it can cause entrapment when you've got multiple fires and you think you're outside of the fire or safe from the fire, and then it's on the other side of you. But perhaps more common and a bigger consideration is that when you get spotting, it's just an indication that you've got extreme fire behavior. You got more severe fire behavior. So we talk about going from rank 3 to 4. If you're starting to see spotting, then things are getting a bit serious, and we want to be careful with that. So I'm moving through this at a good pace, and I would like to do that. So we've talked about describing the fire, where it's burning, how intensely it's burning, and the parts of a wildland fire. You can stop now if there's any questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to the wildland fire behavior triangle. And I can't see the chat box, and I can't see your hands, but I got Chris moderating for me if anyone has any questions. All right, so we'll move along. So the fire behavior triangle is heat, oxygen, and fuel. That's what we need for fire. In the wildland, we talk about the wildland fire behavior triangle because these are the three things that really shape the way that fire behaves in the landscape. And we'll talk about all individually. One thing that's interesting and always cognizant of is the topography, the shape of the land. That's pretty permanent. We're talking in millennial terms of time. Fuel is often seasonal, and we'll talk about that. And we're in quite a particularly interesting season right now in May. And the weather, of course, can vary from moment to moment. So we want to keep that in mind when we look at these as far as their influence on fire, wildland fire. First, we'll start with fuel. First thing I want to talk about before arrangement is fuel moisture. We have a fancy word called pyrolysis. And what it really means is a little piece of trivia is we say that solids and liquids don't burn. It's only gases that burn. And pyrolysis is heating, is when you heat a solid, it lets off flammable gases which will burn. So, okay, well, so basically what we're saying is that if a fuel has a high moisture content, all that water has to be evaporated before you'll get to the part where you get flammable vapors coming off of it. So the more moist is kind of common sense, but the more moisture in a fuel, the more resistance to burning and more heating it will need before it burns. So, just dead grass compared to green grass is a very good example. Then we want to talk about the arrangement. And when we talk about arrangement, we talk about continuous or patchy. So, and when we look at vertical and horizontal, so a good example of vertical would be some places north of here. I know from flying, if you're working, it's a sea of black spruce. So it's pretty continuous fuel. That's all. There's just black spruce for miles. And if fire going that, it's going to be continuous. And that's going to have certain, that'll have a lot of challenges for suppression. Whereas it's easier for us as firefighters if the arrangement is patchy. And patchy is what we often get in the interface or where we have our fires, because maybe you've got some roads and then you've got a grazed pasture and then you've got some spruce conifer, and then you've got maybe some aspen. So different patches. And it may just be the amount of fuel. For example, in a cut block where you've got slash, so branches on the ground and tops, it may be really dense in places and not so much in others. So that's our vertical continuity of fuel. When it comes to horizontal continuity, so going up and down, it's really important to talk about ladder fuels. So if you remember, we talked initially about the types of fire, surface fires and the crown fire. Well, ladder fuels can act, just as the name implies, as a ladder, and it can take the fire from a surface fire to the crowns. So part of our Fire Smart initiatives are to remove those ladder fuels so that they don't spread fires from the surface to the crown if there is a fire. Very good example is balsam fir and black spruce, which we'll talk about next, are significant ladder fuels because usually they have branches right to the ground. Okay, so that's fuel arrangement. I'd like to talk about different fuel types that we have, the main types that we deal with. So conifer fuels. So conifer trees, so pine and spruce, fir, conifer trees, they have needles that contain volatile oils, stuff that's your turpentine comes from, that terps, that stuff is in there. So they're very subject to crown fire. And we'll talk about crown fire and deciduous. It does happen, but it's very rare, whereas it's more common in conifer. The conifer species that we deal with are primarily jack pine and black spruce. We also have white spruce and balsam fir. Now, black spruce, which is what we have in the photo, black spruce is what you'll often see in swamps and muskegs. They have branches to the ground. It's very common with them, and they have their own ladder, make their own ladder fuel. They have it in the tree, it's built in. And it'll be much more common for those stands. We'll go in crown much faster very often than, say, mature pine. Right, and we have something called the spring dip. And the spring dip just means that this is the foliar moisture content of conifers. So the amount of moisture in there, remember we talked about fuels, and the more moisture, the harder it is for it to burn. Well, this time of year in May is when conifer, the moisture is the lowest it'll be through the year. So those conifers are the drier than they'll be any other time of the year in May. And the reason for that is the roots are still frozen, but yet with the warm weather, the stomata, so kind of the holes in the needles and leaves where they breathe through, will open up and photosynthesis will start. So it'll be transpiring and desiccating. So moisture will be leaving the tree, but with the frozen roots, nothing's coming up. And it's also being desiccated over the winter. So it is the time when our conifer fuels are the driest. So they're going to be easier for those to crown. So that's our conifer fuels. Our next fuel type is deciduous. So deciduous, largely aspen, also balsam poplar, white birch we'll see around. And really we're looking at 2 or 3 different fuel types here because it's very distinct when it has leaf off in the spring and fall, as opposed to when it has leaf on during the summer. So when the leaves are off, the sunlight reaches the forest floor, the wind reaches the forest floor, and it dries it out more. The other thing you have is that during the springtime, like now, not only is the sun reaching there and the wind reaching there because there's no leaves, also there's no green undergrowth. So it's driest at this time and will burn most readily. So it's not going to, deciduous doesn't burn as intensely as it will in conifer and crown fuels. I have seen fires that'll go within 20 or 30 meters. It goes from being 100-foot flames in the conifer and dropping down to being 2 or 3-foot flames in the deciduous. But obviously it will carry fire. And once it's leafed out, then the undergrowth is green, it's shaded. When it's shaded, it holds the humidity, keeps the sun out, keeps the wind out more, and it will burn much less readily. So it's not, I can't say it won't burn, but it'll burn much less readily once the leaves are out, which are starting to come out now, once they're fully out, as opposed to when it's leaf off. Again, there are rare cases where deciduous will crown just when the leaves are flushing and the buds are at their most resinous. I've never seen it. I've known it happen and heard of it happening, but never seen aspen crown, but it certainly can happen when we get extreme fire behavior. So that's our deciduous fuel, conifer deciduous, and we have mixed wood, which was just a mixture of conifer and deciduous fuels. And generally, just all we say about the mixed wood is that the greater the conifer component, the more likely it is to crown. And so we might see more extreme fire behavior in our mixed wood if it's heavier to conifer. And the last fuel type that we're going to talk about is grass. And again, it's a very common one for us. And grass, one thing I didn't talk about in fuels is talk about the size of a fuel. So, and we talk about fine, flashy fuels. So if you want to start a fire, campfire, you'll have some bigger wood, but you always start with your smaller wood. And then maybe you have shavings to get it started. And the idea is the greater your surface area to mass ratio, there's more surface area to burn, but also what happens with grass is because it's so fine textured, is that it really picks up and sheds moisture easily. So rapidly, when we get damp weather like we've had now, it will rapidly pick up that moisture, so it'll be harder to burn. But yet, remember the fire that we had in Rich Lake not too long ago? We had snow on the ground 2 days previous. Grass will very quickly lose that moisture as well. So in the spring, the grass is matted and dry. In the summer, it's standing and green. In the fall, it's standing and dead. So it probably burns the best when it's matted because it's kind of collected at this time of year. So at this point, I'm going to bring something up that I'm going to talk about repeatedly, and you'll hear. But there's certain factors that contribute to wildland fire fatalities, often from entrapment, being trapped by the fire. And one of those is fine, flashy fuels. And sometimes we think that those big conifer fuels might be, those huge conifer fires, those big crown fires, that might be more dangerous. It is maybe in itself, but maybe it's because it doesn't seem so dangerous, that it's the fine, flashy fuels that burn so readily and quickly that it's often those fires that more commonly trap and kill firefighters than large conifer fuel going off. So we want to be aware of that term fine flashy fuels in grass. Okay, so again, we've talked about the fuel side of the fire behavior triangle. And one thing I think you remember I said initially, our topography is pretty constant. Our fuels change to the season and our weather moment to moment. But some of the seasonal stuff I may have touched on that you may clue into is that May is a particularly hazardous time for forest fires because our grass is dry and hasn't greened up, so fire will spread through that rapidly. If it hits an aspen stand, it will burn through that more readily than it will at other times of the year. And if it hits conifer, because it's at its driest, it's most likely and most intensely to burn. So you can see we talked about continuity of fuel. So if you have, in the summertime, if you've got green grass, that may interrupt the continuity. If you've got a green aspen stand that's shaded and cooler, that may interrupt the continuity of a fire. But right now, with our dry grass and with leaf-off aspen with a dry understory, we have quite a bit of continuity of fuel. And that's one of the reasons why we see some extreme fires at this time of year. So that's it for fuel for now. Next, we're going to talk about weather. Now, I'm no meteorologist, no expert in this, but we have to have a decent understanding of weather to understand how fire behaves. We talked about pyrolysis and heating those fuels. So obviously, the higher the temperature, the more fuels are going to preheat. High temperatures actually have less impact on fuels and wildfire than we sometimes think. And humidity is much more so, because we've had some very cold weather and we can get some pretty intense fires. So we will talk about RH. Now, precipitation, obviously it wets those fuels and makes them harder to ignite, particularly the fine flashy fuels like grass, which will absorb that moisture. So it's kind of common sense. Warm temperature will burn better. Precipitation is going to make it burn less. It's the RH that's really important, our relative humidity. Well, what relative humidity? Well, if you've got 60, 70, even 50, that's fairly damp. When we get into the 40s, it will certainly burn. Grass will certainly burn in the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, but we get it down into the low teens, and that can be really something. We'll talk a bit more about humidity when we talk about crossover. Then we have winds. So winds push fire, and what they bend the flame over so it preheats the fuels in front of it faster. So I mean, well, that's kind of technical in a sense, but all this, but common intuition will tell you that the wind will blow the fire faster. Now, when I talked about fine flashy fuels, when it comes to weather, it's an unexpected increase or change in wind direction that's associated with wildland fire entrapments. And remember, if you go back to the parts of a wildfire, we talked about the flank and the head. If you think that you're on the flank of a fire and it's not burning towards you and it's not as intense, and then you get a wind shift and suddenly you've got the head of the fires coming at you, you can maybe imagine why an unexpected increase or change in wind direction can be associated with fire entrapment, people being trapped by the fire. We'll come back to that. I mentioned crossover. A lot of you may be familiar with crossover. It's when your temperature in degrees Celsius is lower than your RH in percentage. So lucky for us, here we are in Canada, we're using Celsius, so this rule works. It doesn't quite work the same with Fahrenheit. So an example of crossover, 20 degrees Celsius, 18, 15% RH, you get crossover. What happens when we get crossover is this: we get very easy ignition, and given any wind, we'll get rapid spread, and it can be very difficult to extinguish these fires. Sometimes sometimes you'll see that if you're on a large fire for multiple days, sometimes you'll see crossover because you'll know when it happens because your fire behavior all suddenly changes. And where you had smoke and smoldering, you've got open flame. Which kind of leads us into our peak burn period. So if we talk about temperature and humidity, well, we know that at nighttime, our humidity goes up and our temperature's down. So through the morning, it warms up. And then generally between noon and say 7 o'clock at night is our peak burn period. So that's going to be when our temperatures are highest and our humidities are the lowest. And you may just notice this from a lot of our fires. They're around 3 o'clock or 5 o'clock. Is very commonly when we get wildland fires. It's important to understand that peak burn period when it comes to sizing things up and determining what to expect, because it can go both ways. If you're looking at a fire at 10 o'clock in the morning or at noon, and you're seeing fire behavior and you think, oh, no problem, this thing's not so bad. Well, we can expect it to get worse or change as we get into the afternoon. Conversely, if that fire is out of control and unstoppable at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, we know that it's going to sit down eventually and be less intense. And we'll talk about using dozers and heavy equipment, but very often that's when we're thinking, okay, this fire is a bit of a runaway now. Maybe we'll try and control the rear of the fire. Maybe we'll have some aircraft protecting values in front, but we're not going to be able to do too much of it until that fire behavior drops. So that's when we send our cats out at night. And then we often try to get firefighters starting very early so they can get a lot of work done in the morning before that peak burn hits. So that peak burn period between noon and maybe 7 o'clock is very important to understand. Again, I'm not going to get into the meteorology a whole bunch, but cold front passage, pretty common for that to happen. And we'll see it in the forecast and we'll think, great, it's going to get cooler and we're going to get some precip. And that is great. But what we get with the cold front is we usually get strong gusty winds when we get a wind shift. As we remember, those are things that can get us into trouble. So we want to look in our forecast when we're on these fires and see if there is a cold front passage forecast, and then be cognizant of that and aware of that if it does come to pass. It's very common in our part of the country, and a lot of our fires over the years, including the one we had in Hilo just last week, we get strong southeast winds for days on end, and they'll go all through the night. And it's pretty scary if you get a fire going, because it's hard to control when you've got those winds all night. That's what we had on that fire. What's very common is to get a cold front passage. And I remember, for example, the House River fire, it's going back a long way. So it's coming from the southeast. So it's coming up at a 45-degree angle. We get that wind shift. I know in the House River fire, the whole northeast flank basically blew out and turned it into a triangular fire because again, that flank became the head. So that's significant with cold front passage, to be aware of that. And lastly, cumulus clouds. So again, I'm no meteorologist. So the ones, big fluffy ones, look like cauliflower, and particularly cumulonimbus. And that's something to do with Harry Potter. I'm not sure, those nimbus. That's what you're looking at in that photo. It's cumulonimbus clouds. We talked about an anvil shape. So it's got that sheared top and a dark bottom. And the really dark bottom is off. It's just shade because it's so dense, the sunlight's not getting through. When we see those cumulus clouds, we see those cumulonimbus clouds, they can cause downdrafts. So downdraft, so the is a rush of air coming straight down from the cloud. So if it's coming straight down, that means when it hits the ground, it could go in any direction, in every direction. So that can be dangerous so we see those cells, we want to be aware of that because the wind can be gusting and it can be from any direction. A general rule of thumb we have is if you can put yourself between the fire and the cell, the cloud, that's good, because if the wind comes down and towards you, then it's going to be towards the fire. But often what happens is you've got a whole bunch of these clouds coming through at once, and it's not that clean or that easy. We want to be aware of that. So that's about it for weather. Again, it's kind of quick and dirty, but I'm going to be repetitive, and I know that. We talk about fuel, we really watch those fine, flashy fuels, and we talk about weather. Be aware of increased winds or wind changes, because those are the things that can get us into trouble. All right. So any questions on fuel or weather, let me know, or we can come back to questions at the end as well. All right, last part of the wildland fire triangle. Wildland fire triangle is topography, fuel, weather, and topography. So topography is shape of the ground. And again, you're getting right to the point. Steep slopes are associated with wildland fire and entrapment fatalities. So working on steep slopes. The way I always put it is fire moves faster and we move slower. So fire moves faster uphill. And it's similar to when I talked about wind bending the flame. Well, just imagine if you tilt the ground. So your flame is vertical, but on the uphill side, it's closer to the fuel. So it's going to preheat it. So it's closer to that fuel. So it's going to go faster uphill. Then often we get convective currents to hot air rising, carrying it up those slopes. So we want to be careful when we're dealing with slope. And as in this photograph, which is out by Churchill Park, it doesn't just have to be mountains where you see slope. We get slope around here. And that can cause that increase in fire behavior and speed, particularly, that can overtake us and surprise us. So there's slope is the biggest one. Now there's also topographical features, more of them to deal with the mountains, but we don't deal with the mountains so much. But we do have river valleys. So for example, the Beaver River Valley. If we've got a west winds are common, that's our predominant wind is from the west. So if it's a west wind, it's whistling down the Beaver River Valley, and then it veers and goes to the south. The wind is not just going to keep going west, it's going to be funneled and it's going to be redirected. So we need to be aware of that. So topography, it can funnel the wind and it can redirect it. Again, we're not in the mountains, but we really do want to talk about gullies. So a gully, think about on steep land where you often see it's eroded and maybe a creek's coming down. That's a gully, so where it's really been or kind of a low spot there. But they can act just like a chimney. Often we call them chimneys. So they can be very dangerous because you're going to get extreme fire behavior. It's going to be funneled into those. And sometimes when you're in steep country, you might be tempted to use those for traversing a land because they're lower, because there may not be vegetation. But gullies can be very dangerous. We want to be aware of that. Last thing we'll talk about with topography, again, the main thing is slope, but the last thing we'll talk about with topography is aspect. So aspect is the direction that a slope faces. And again, it's what it's facing. So in this photograph, for example, this slide, where we've got the cleared grass, that would be a west or a southern exposure. So that's a southern aspect or a western aspect. And south and west aspects, south because it's facing south where the sun is, and west because it's getting the afternoon sun, they're going to be hotter and drier than a north or a east aspect, something that faces north or east. And again, if I think about the Beaver River Valley, maybe even Lac La Biche, we can often see that in the vegetation that we have. And often we have aspen and grassy slopes on the south-facing slopes, and on the north-facing slopes, where it's cooler and damper, we'll often see spruce growing there. So that's pretty common. So we've got fuels that are more likely to burn faster and readier, and we've got that more heat. So the heat's going to be higher, the humidity lower earlier in the day on those south-facing and west-facing slopes and aspects. And you can see in this photograph too the effect that it has on spring melt. That can be quite outstanding at times when you're driving down a highway. 28, for example, because it goes east-west, sometimes it's very noticeable, or 55 as well, that you've got snow in the ditch on the south side. On the north side, it's free of snow. Again, that's the impact of aspect. So we talked about wildland fire behavior triangle. We talked about fuels, weather, and topography. And we're going to talk again. I keep talking about the relation to fatality fires. So what they've discovered, or what they've determined, is there's 4 common factors to wildland fire entrapment fatalities. One is a small fire or quiet section of a larger fire. So that's basically people have got their guard down. It's where you don't expect it. Things always go wrong when you're not expecting it. So it's on a small fires or a quiet section of a larger fire. And the other 3 we've already talked about. They're linked to fuel, weather, and topography. Those being fine, flashy fuels. So the weather would be a change in wind direction or velocity, increase in the wind speed, a change of direction, and topography is slope. We'll talk about some specific examples when we get to the safety section. So I didn't have my slides to show it. So fine, flashy fuel. People say, oh, it's just grass, but you're looking at their flames that are 6, 8, 10 feet and pretty intense. So it doesn't mean you're just going to waltz through something like that. And if it takes over you, it definitely has potential to kill us. High winds, from the Newbrook fire in 2008, but just look how vertical that column is and how fast that pushes the fire. And then steep slope. Okay, this is not a local shot. But there you go, fire going quite extreme upslope. So we want to be cognizant of that. So again, don't expect you to remember all this, but I think this is a good introduction. We've talked about wildland fire behavior, the interaction of fuels, weather, and topography on our wildland fire. And next, we're going to talk about suppression, how we put out these fires, how we control these fires. So there's 2 main means of fire suppression. There's direct attack and indirect attack. And direct attack is when you bring the business to the fire. You attack the fire, you put it out. And that's what we most commonly do. And commonly it's done with pump and hose or our backpack pumps is how we usually do it. And very often that direct attack, it'll be safer if you come from the rear and up the flanks and then work your way to the head. Now there are times, especially in grass, where we don't have a lot burning in between, where we can go right up the middle and kind of knock out the head from the safety of the black. But if it's burning, say, an aspen, and we don't want to be in the smoke and you're trying to catch up, usually we'll go along the flanks and then up to the head. That's direct attack. Indirect attack is less common, but you establish and widen a fire guard ahead of the fire where it's anticipated to arrive. Now, in a sense, if we do look back at the Hilo fire that we had a week or 2 ago, we tried direct attack. We had the Helitack crew bucketing and using backpack water pumps. We tried to get our SSVs to the fire to attack it. They got stuck. So we tried direct attack and it kind of we weren't successful. It got away on us. So then we went with indirect attack. In a sense, we had a fire line remote from the fire being the road 165. So we're going to hold it here. So in a way, it was a bit of both because that was our line where we're going to hold it. Once the fire got there, you could say that it was direct attack as we were attacking the fire itself. Something we'll often do with the indirect attack is widen the perimeter. And often we'll do this by burning out, by strip burning. And, well, sorry. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that later. So, but that's direct attack is you take the business to the fire and put it out. Indirect attack is we pick a spot, maybe remote, where we're going to try and widen our control line and control the fire there. A very important concept for wildland firefighting. I don't care if it's some wildfire crew or structural crew, people make this mistake all the time. And we really need to focus on the fire line or fire guard around the perimeter, because the perimeter control is key. We have what we call candle moth syndrome, where you see something burning a lot. It's really intense fire, so we tend to key in on that. But if that intense fire is inside the black, inside the burned area, and you're concentrating on that while the perimeter is out of control and the fire is spreading, you're not controlling the fire. So we really want to concentrate on getting that perimeter controlled. And if it's something burning intensely inside that's threatening to get out, that's something. Like you've got black spruce that's torching and it's only 10 feet from the line. Well, then, yeah, it's threatening to get over the line. But if it's 100 meters inside, is probably not much of a threat. We need to focus on getting our perimeter. One of the methods we have for perimeter control is called hot spotting. And hot spotting is when we quickly get around the perimeter, knocking the fire down. But because we want to get around it quickly and get it under control, we're not thoroughly extinguishing it. So when we hotspot, we're going around quickly, often with a backpack water pump or a hose, and knocking it down. But it's got to be followed up by more thorough extinguishment. Otherwise, it's going to come back up. But we do that hotspotting so we can get it under control quickly. And again, a very common thing to do, because it takes more time to lay hose, is we will send people ahead with backpack water pumps to knock it down, and then follow up with pump and hose where we can more thoroughly extinguish it. That's an example of hot spotting. All right. So our general methods, direct attack and indirect attack, and we really want to concentrate on our perimeter. When we talk about wet line, that's our most common extinguishment. We have a pump and a hose, and we put water on the fire, put the wet stuff on the red stuff, and extinguish the fire. And any fuels directly adjacent, we're wetting them down. And we call that building wet line, we might call it, and that's very common. Burnout we can also use to increase that guard, that break, and remove fuels in front of it by widening that. Strip burning, there's a lot, but if you picture the side of a road and grass next to it, and the wind is blowing towards the road, if you go with a fusee or a drip torch and light it up just a meter in, just 3 feet in, and the wind's only going to blow, the wind's going to blow it. It's not going to burn back the other direction. And it's only three feet, 1 meter. So you can be ready with water and control that. Well, if you do that twice, now you've got 6 feet or 2 meters, and you've got a bigger buffer on your road. So those strips can get wider and wider. And then when the fire finally arrives, then you've taken the steam out of it because you've removed, by making the fire line that much wider, you've removed it, the fuel from in front of it. So that's burning out. So we talk about wet line, but we also talk about dry line, and that might just be where we're removing the fuel from the surface. In the mountains, and you'll see in the States, they'll do that with hose, like with a hand hoe, with a Pulaski. And they're scraping away that surface. Well, our surface soils are pretty deep, so we commonly use bulldozers to build dozer guard. It's very effective in the deep soils that we have, and in the frozen soils that we have. Our muskeg will be frozen well into June. It's very effective at night when it's not safe for crews to be on the line. They're often off, and the fire is less intense. So again, as I described, often it gets away in the afternoon. We'll get the dozers out that night. And typically we have 3 dozers working in a group, especially in forested areas. The first dozer knocks down the trees, the second windrows them away from the fire, and the third clears the ground to mineral soil. In remote areas, we'll add a helipad, like 100 feet square, 30 meters square, every 2 kilometers or something. And this provides a place where helicopters can land, but also provides safety zones. And the dozer guard itself provides access to safety zones. So dozer guard, it stops the surface fire, it gets the fuel out of the way, but it's also very good access for crews and equipment on the guard. And again, a guard is meant to stop surface fire. So generally they're 1.5 blades wide, so maybe 5 or 6 meters. Widening can be effective, but only to a point. Because remember, if you get extreme fire behavior, fire can spot for 1 kilometer. So it's not practical to make a guard so wide. So basically, it can stop the surface fire, then that's what we're looking for. Also, we talked about hot spotting. So if dozers go around, then they can go much faster than crews can lay hose. So often with dozers, we'll have a water carrier. So very commonly a nod well, because they can travel on wet ground. That's a tracked vehicle. Or sometimes we'll use skidders in the interface, or if you've got dry land, they're a bit faster and the wheels are better on roads. And they'll have water carriers. So they'll carry like 200 gallons or so, 1,000 liters of water with a pump and a short length of hose. And that way they can hotspot. So while the crew is laying hose along the dozer guard, if there's a particular spot where it's flaring up and threatening to jump the line, then that water carrier can go up there with a few firefighters and take water to it. All right, so that's our most common use of heavy equipment. There's other, you can use excavators, but most commonly You excavators, graders, you can till, like with tractors. Most all commonly we see bulldozers and water carriers on our fires. I'm going to talk a bit about aircraft. So RW, or rotary wing, is a term we often use for helicopters. So a helicopter has three main uses on a fire, and that could be reconnaissance, bucketing, and moving crews. So reconnaissance, one of the issues we had with that fire in Hilo the other week was it's just difficult to see it. When it gets big, it's hard to see it. So getting up in the air, you don't have the drone, getting up in the air is good to be able to see it and size it up properly. So very good for reconnaissance. Bucketing, as you can see in the photograph, is dropping buckets of water. Now, a bucket's fairly small compared to, say, an air tanker, but it can also be very precise where they put it. So drop for drop, liter for liter, it can be very precise. And it's very good for spot fires in particular. It's good for spot fires. It's good for protecting crews, whether it's people on the ground or whether it's bulldozers. And they're also good for protecting structures around spot fires around structures and cooling fires around structures. So helicopters are good for that. And the other thing, less in the interface or where we're fighting fires in the settled areas, but they also use for moving crews in remote areas to get them onto the fire line. One of the reconnaissance, and often too, it's funny, when we did a debriefing for that last fire that we had in Hilo, someone brought up, well, you should have got a reconnaissance machine first thing. And they're right, because often the first thing we want is a reconnaissance machine if we're going to request something from forestry. So we can see what we've got to deal with, and if we need buckets, machines for bucketing. And also the beauty of getting a reconnaissance machine is often it will have a wildfire assessor with it, so a fairly experienced firefighter. And in my own excuse, the reason I didn't ask for reconnaissance machines is because we already had intermediate on their bucketing, and I thought I'd be able to get a reconnaissance flight with it, but it didn't work out that way. But that's fine. So reconnaissance is to look at the fire. Usually we can use smaller helicopters for that. Bucketing, so it would be a light, like a 206, we call it a light helicopter, and the cheapest, good for reconnaissance. Mediums, like a 216, they're good for bucketing, because they have a bigger, like up to 300-gallon bucket. Intermediate, like our A-stars, is somewhere in between, and they're quite versatile, so they can move crews, they can do reconnaissance, and they can bucket pretty good, though not as good as a medium. All right, so that's rotary wing aircraft, helicopters. Then we look at fixed wing aircraft for controlling wildfires. And they drop either retardant or Class A foam. And as I said, a rotary wing is good for dropping in spot fires. But you want to lay a line. When you've got a big line that you want to drop, fixed wing is better, as you can see in this photograph where they're dropping retardant. So retardant, it coats the fuel in front of the fire, and the coated fuel won't burn, is the theory. And it certainly works to some extent. It's not foolproof. So it can be delivered in 2 or 3 drops from a larger airplane, not all at once. And that can be useful. You might go across the head and up the most busy flank or both flanks. After they drop their load of retardant, they have to return to the airbase to reload again with retardant. Retardant drops are excellent for protecting interface values. So often we get these fires, we can't control the fire. So one of our objectives comes to protect values in front of it, and laying a red line around something can really help protect. And I've seen on a lot of big fires where in the fire, amongst the fire, you'll see structures or infrastructure they painted it red, they drop retardant around it, and it survives. So it's can be quite effective. Now skimmers, they drop Class A foam, so they mix water with foam concentrate, and they drop water and foam, so Class A foam. And half of it goes on the fire front and half in front of it is the idea. They can skim off of lakes, so once they drop their load, they don't need to return to the airport until they get low on fuel. So they can drop their load of water and then keep coming, as long as they can skim and return to the fire. I remember we did have a fire very close to Lac La Biche Lake, and we had the 215s, they're really loud planes, and we had 3 of them, but they were so close to the lake that by the time number 3 had gone, number 1 was back, so it was a constant run. The lake, they need roughly a mile, or 1.6 kilometers length and 2 meters deep to be able to skim. So and obviously it can't be ice on it, which up until a week ago was limiting for us. Well, air tankers are great, they do have their limitations. When do we get really bad fires? When winds are really high. And winds can limit air tankers. So, for example, if they're skimming and you've got white tops on the lake, they're not going to be able to skim very efficiently. But also, it's just the capacity for aircraft to work in those fires. During this, I talked to one of the bird dog officers who was working with the air tractors during the Slave Lake fire. And their group of 6 planes, they actually broke. They did damage to 2 of them. They were trying so hard. But there's just limitations. So the planes can only do so much. Another limitation can be smoke. When that column drops when there's smoke over top of the fire, they can't see it, right? So and they can't see it to make their drops, but they can be very, very effective. And they're very expensive. $10,000 for a drop. What you see in that photograph is $10,000. So they're very expensive. Us as a municipal department, we might call for it when we see out of control fire and it's threatening structures, and we think it would be useful. Again, it's good to get that assessment because you've got an experienced wildland firefighter telling you should do that. It gives you a bit more confidence with making that kind of purchase, essentially. So that's kind of it for wildland fire suppression. We've got direct attack, indirect attack. We have different tools in our toolbox. We use pump and hose, backpack pumps. We use heavy equipment. We use aircraft, rotary wing and fixed wing. Like any other kind of firefighting, those are our strategies. Those are tools in our toolbox that we have to use our experience to size up the situation, come up with some objectives, and those are strategies that we can try to employ to control the fire. I'm going to talk about the interface a bit now, and we're not going to talk this in great depth. So again, not expecting you to know this stuff. Is more of an introduction. But there's a few things we want to know. We want to understand how fire spreads in the interface. And while it is true that radiant heat will ignite structures, it's more common for a shower of embers. So we get that crown fire in that conifer, sending out a bunch of sparks, a bunch of burning embers that will get blown ahead of the fire. And there can be a lot of them falling. And if they find some place that they can burn, they land in somewhere where they can burn, then they will ignite. And very commonly, it's the embers that ignite structures. So when we're looking at fuels in the structures, things in the interface, we want to think of them in terms of fuel. Are they already fuel? And are they close enough to heavy, say, black spruce or balsam fir, heavy conifer forest that radiant heat will damage them or burn them? And that was the case in that fire that we had recently in Hilo, because it was surrounded by white spruce to such proximity that the radiant heat was a threat. But whereas very often, especially in a conflagration such as Fort McMurray or Slave Lake, it's the ember shower. So when we look at our structure that we're dealing with, if we want to think, if an ember lands on that, will it stay or will it slide off? Will it burn or will it burn out? So an example there might be, if it lands on a shake roof that has a bunch of pine needles on it, it's not going to slide off, and with the pine needles and the shakes, it'll burn. If it lands on a steep tin roof, it's not going to burn on the tin, and if it's steep, it's going to slide off. So we kind of look at things in the sense of fuel. So in S215, and of course we're not getting into that, we just talk about it. They talk about offensive attack and defensive and combination attacks. Offensive is what we really talked about when we talked about direct attack. Offensive is that you'll protect the structures by putting out the fire. If you can put the fire out, then we concentrate on that. But as we said, sometimes you can't do that. You can't control the fire. So that's when we get into defensive or combination mode. And it's a bit confusing between the two of them, so kind of usually combine them. Defensive and combination attacks. So defensive is basically preparing structures before it gets there, and then combination is when it's there, the fire passes. Can we stay and put out fire, spot fires, protect the structure, and fire as it passes? Can we do that safely? Structure protection crews are what we often doing that role. Structure protection crew, just a little bit on their organization. Commonly, it's a leader with 4 members. You may have a wildland unit like our SSVs, a small type 6 or 7 engine, and access to a sprinkler trailer. And they work under the ICS structure, maybe usually under a strike team leader or division or group supervisor, branch director, ops chief, or IC. So yeah, that's just a little bit on how a structure protection crew works. Now, when it comes to the interface, it's not just how you fight. We talk about time and incident phases and actions that we do. So pre-impingement, before the fire comes, impingement when it's there, and post-impingement afterwards. And pre-impingement, we're going to try and prepare the structures, and we'll talk a little bit about triage. Impingement, we have a choice where we can try and hold the fire around it, put out spot fires and steer it around the structure, or it's not safe and we retreat. And whether we stay or hold or retreat, post-impingement, you want to patrol and mop up. So we're doing in the interface. So triage and structure and site preparation. Triage, I talked a little bit about, will an ember land there? Will it ignite? And what we want to do is we want to look at area triage. We look at a large community, and whether it's defensible. When we triage, we want to know, is something defensible or is it not defensible? Or does it not need defense? So if it doesn't need any defense, then it needs no attention. If it's defendable, then we say savable with attention. Or they don't like the term hopeless because it's a bit negative perhaps, but hopeless is one we use. There's variations on those labels where it doesn't make sense for us to put so much effort into this one where we're probably going to lose it, and then we're going to lose a lot of others that we could have saved because they were marginal. So again, we don't want to concentrate on the hopeless ones. This whole idea of triage, focusing our effort on what's savable with attention. And when we're assessing them, really quickly, I look at it spatially. So you look at the top of the building. So you're looking at how flammable is it? Will it hold an ember? So the top of the building, the roof, then the sides of the building, what it's made of, any horizontal surfaces that will hold embers, such as a deck, vegetation that's directly next to the structure, and then increasingly vegetation and any fuels as you move out away from the structure. And that's how we largely determine our triage. There are other factors that come in, but largely we're looking at how readily will this burn. And once we've done our triage, and if we have time before the fire gets there, then we do our structure and site preparation. And essentially, as we treat everything as fuel, we have three broad options. We can wet that fuel down so it doesn't burn. We can cover it up so the embers don't get to it, or we can remove it from close to the structure so that when it does burn, it's not going to be an issue. Examples of wetting down most commonly would be sprinklers. When we set up sprinklers, it wets the fuel down. Covering, we might put a tarp over, so we get a large pile of firewood, we just put a tarp over it. And by the time, even if it's just a poly tarp, by the time the ember burns through it, the ember's gone out. You might use found materials such as plywood or tin. You might have a roll of poly that we wrap around an unskirted trailer. That would be covering. And then removing the fuel, it might be raking leaves and needles away from directly in contact with the structure, or throwing stacked firewood away from it. So that's, in a nutshell, triage and structure and site preparation in the interface. And we have some, again, we talk about holding, so we have some unique engine operations. So when we're in the interface, we don't get tied into a hydrant, very static like we do in a structure fire. We want to be mobile because the fire is going to be moving through. It's a fire front. We might have to follow it, and we may have to get out quickly. So we want to stay mobile. One thing we can do sometimes is lay a couple of lines around a house. We can pre-prepare like this, putting 2 lengths of forestry hose, as on the left here, around a structure. And then if you need to go, you can just disconnect and go. But those 2 lines, you've got 2 lines to try and steer the fire around the structure and possibly also to put out spot fires. But again, in the interface, it's important that we stay mobile. So again, that's just a little really brief touch on interface firefighting. We're concentrating more on wildland. So final part here we're getting into, so we are getting near the end here, is safety. So we're talking about wildland urban interface safety, and we're talking about wildland safety. So in the interface, we have a combination of wildland and urban hazards. So we're always dealing with physical exertion and heat, right? So we need to stay adequately hydrated. Electrical and overhead hazards. So we get those a lot in the interface. So maybe power lines. Power lines may be down. You may not see them in the smoke. We may be dealing with hazardous materials. So that might be in agricultural or industrial or homeowners having different hazardous materials that are being involved. Driving is dangerous. Structural or wildland is one of the highest fatality events is driving. And it can be exacerbated in the interface because you've got smoke, so you can't see as well, but also you might have residents that are fleeing, that are panicked, but also just can't see you very well, and they're going in the opposite direction. So we want to be aware of that hazard. Limited access can be a real hazard for us in the interface and any wildland fire. How are we accessing it? Are we able, if we have to get out in a hurry, can we get out? Or is there only one way in and out? We need to be aware of that. In the interface, and even in a lot of our fires, because it's mixed agricultural and wildland, dangerous pets or livestock, be aware of those. Working around heavy equipment can be hazardous. So we have to be, there's different rules we'll follow for that. We have to be careful working around heavy equipment, such as your visibility, wearing high-vis clothing. A general rule for dozers is we stay 2 tree lengths away from them because the tree they knock over may knock down another one. Generally, we get out of the way and let them pass. Fire entrapment, we're going to talk about in quite a bit of detail. Now, cardiac arrest, driving, and aircraft accidents, they're the biggest killers in wildland and the interface. Cardiac, more so for us structural firefighters and volunteer firefighters. A lot of wildland firefighters are young people. Yeah, and whereas you get more of a mix with particularly volunteer departments. And most susceptible are people like myself, volunteers over 40, were the ones that keel over the most often with cardiac arrest. So all these hazards are still there in the interface. We're going to talk also about personal protective equipment, laces, entrapment and laces in specific. So we'll move on next and talk about our personal protective equipment. Excuse me. So structural personal protective equipment is too hot, it's too cumbersome. Like, there's exceptions, right? We get the shoulder season, or it's, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, or it's midnight and it's 2 degrees. Well, maybe that's not unreasonable. Certainly if it's small fire, it's going to be small at that time of day, probably. But for the most part, we don't want to be wearing our bunker gear. Part of the problem with wearing bunker gear, not only is it too hot and cumbersome, but then you don't wear it. So often, how often do you see people, they have no jacket on, they have no helmet on because it's their structural one, and they're not going to wear it. So our standard PPE is fire-resistant coveralls, a hard hat, work boots with it. Now it's better, our leather boots are pretty good now that we have, better than the rubber boots we had before, although a lot of people like rubber boots too. But work boots with a good ankle support and aggressive tread you want. Instead of our structural gloves, leather or cotton gloves are all that we need. Safety glasses or goggles are pretty common. People like goggles, they look cool on your helmet, but I just find that glasses you're more likely to wear. They're comfortable, they're lighter, and you're more likely to wear them. If it's really bad smoke, the goggles are good, but that's the exception. And generally people wear the glasses more. Another important consideration is the web belt that you see this fellow wearing here. The way I kind of describe that is, if we're working on a normal fire, say structure fire or car fire, and you get hurt, you want the first aid kit, where is it? Well, you go over to the engine and get it. You want a drink of water, well, you go over to the truck and get it. But if you're working a mile away from the truck and you get injured, or you want a drink, it's good to have some of that equipment with you. So personal first aid kit, water, are very common things to have on a web belt. So it's good to have those. And I know we do have some in our wildland units. And a lot of people just have their own personal, but it's a good thing to think about. So your structural PPE, including your FCBA, it's nice to have on hand if we're dealing with an entrapment situation. It doesn't necessarily justify bringing it for extended, if you go on an extended structure protection deployment. Generally, we like to bring them even when we go to wildland fires because we don't know what we're getting into, or we might get another call, particularly if we're going in the engine. Maybe not so much in the wildland unit, but it's good to have your that full structural PPE. If you do get in a entrapment situation, you have an opportunity to access it. So one of the last things we are going to talk about is entrapment. So entrapment is being trapped by the fire. And here we can talk about some of the bad fires that we've experienced. Entrapment is being overrun by a fire, and it can result in a high number of fatalities in one incident. And there's 3 glaring examples. First is Man Gulch in 1949. There was 13 firefighters were overrun by fire and killed there. And the Storm King Mountain in 1994, 14 firefighters killed. And more recently, and more of you will probably be familiar with the Yarnell Hill fire in 2013, where 19 firefighters died. Now, for myself, I really like studying these fires because there's so much to learn. And you think, oh, couldn't happen to me. I'm too good. Like I know what I'm doing. They were silly to do that. But you read these books, and if you know anything about disasters, or I guess even health and safety or accidents, often it's just this cascading events. It's this long chain of little mistakes, little things going the wrong way that lead up to catastrophe. And some of those books, if you're interested in reading them, Young Men in Fire is about the Man Gulch fire in 1949. Fire on the Mountain is about Storm King Mountain in 1994. Both of those written by a fellow called McLean. The father wrote the one in 49 and his son wrote the one in 94. And then there's different books. There's two books I've read on the Yarnell Hill fire. One's called The Fire Line, and it's quite good, done by a journalist. And there's another one done by it's kind of a biography. It's a bit more, I don't know, tabloid-like. I shouldn't say that. It's not nice, but it's not as analytical, but it's more personal. It's a good one too, and it's by the survivor, the 20-person crew. So I find it's worthwhile studying those books. There's a lot to learn from them, and a lot to learn not just about fire behavior and firefighting, but just disaster and what can go wrong. Because the other example I always give when I talk about this is Death on the Ice. People that went to school in Newfoundland, they had to read that, but Death on the Ice is a book found very interesting. It's about the 1916 sealing disaster. And I forget how many sealers died on the ice, 70 or 90. It's quite a few. And when I read that book, it was just striking to me how miscommunications and the wrong decisions by people in command and supervisory positions can lead to these disasters. So again, I find that, sorry I spent a lot of time talking about those books and these incidents, but I find it's really worth studying to learn from that. Both Man Gulch and Storm King, we had what I talked about. There was steep slopes, there was fine flashy fuels, and there was a wind shift. Now in Yarnell Hill, to be honest, I'm not sure if slope was an issue. We know it was fine flashy fuels, and we know it was a wind shift that took the fire where it was not expected. So those again are common factors, fatality factors. So we're going to talk about what to do. First, we're going to talk about how to deal with an entrapment, and lastly, we're going to talk about how to avoid one. So if you're facing an entrapment, so basically you're unable to outrun the fire and it's coming towards you. So what do? Notify your supervisor and request air support if it's available. Don't panic, we always say. I think it's kind of funny advice. Don't panic. Okay, what does that mean? Don't panic. Essentially, what not panicking means is to make size things up and make some decisions that can influence the outcome in your favor. So when we're dealing with grass fires, again, grass fires can kill people. They can move fast and they can be big and they can kill people. And if you run with it, you're going to be exposed to it longer. So sometimes what we'll do with a fire such as a grass fire is we will pass through the fire front. So what we want to do is pick an area where the fuels are lighter, where it's going to be burning less intensely. Pick that as an area where we want to pass through the front. You want to cover any exposed flesh, and often that's going to be your face when we're wearing our wildland PPE. I always chuckle when they say use a shovel, but I know I trip and get a shovel in the face. So what you can do is just get your gloved hands in front of your face. And as we learn some structural incidents and some explosions, take a deep breath before you cross that fire line. So you get lungs full of fresh air. So you're not going to take a breath as you're passing through that superheated air. And quickly cross as quick as you can into the black where it's safe. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that if it's more intense fire, if it's conifer burning, but it can be a good option for grass. Sheltering in place, you're not going to outrun the fire, so not a good option. But again, if it's going to overtake you, if you can make some decisions, get some things in your favor. So look for a location with light fuels. Look for an obstacle, say perhaps a fallen log, to protect you from radiant heat, and lie down and keep your face close to the ground as the fire passes. Not a very good situation to be in. We don't use fire shelters in Canada. And basically, it's a decision, excuse me, by our fire agencies that there's question about their efficacy. It's one of those safety things too. Does it give you a false sense of security? So in Canada, we really focus on laces, which is the next slide, to avoid entrapment as opposed to shelters. Now, especially in the interface, you may have the option to shelter in a structure, in a house, or in a vehicle. If that's the case, and you have access to your personal protective equipment, including your breathing apparatus, by all means, put it on, don it. And then wet down the structure, control spot fires if you can, stop it from igniting or prolong the ignition of it. So what often will happen was the fire front will pass and then structures will burn after that. So by sheltering in the structure, you hope that by the time the structure becomes untenable and you need to leave it, that the main wildland fire front has passed and it'll be safer outside. Vehicles can be, they're not as good, obviously much protection as a structure. The glass can break. Same thing, stay low, put on your bunker gear if you have it. It's interesting, Australia and a lot of their fire apparatus are equipped with sprinklers, so they can shelter in those if they're overrun. And they have sprinkler systems set up that will sprinkler all around the apparatus. But those are some of your options if you're going to be caught in the fire entrapment. Really what we want to do is not. And the way we try to avoid that is we use a safety acronym of LACES. Try to avoid too many acronyms, but traditionally we talk about 18 fire orders or 12 or 15 watch out situations. And they have list all these things. And they're great. And they're great if you have time to study them. And they'll tell you dangerous situations and what can go wrong. What can go wrong? And sorry, yeah, Brad, we are going to do a report. New Hook or I will do one, and it'll be headquarters training. So sorry, just got a text there. I have my laptop, desktop, and my phone going. But anyway, I'll get back to this. So avoiding entrapment, we look at our LACES. They had all these acronyms, and they kind of boiled them down to LACES to try and make it concise. And in the States, they don't even have the A. It's just LCES. Well, let's talk about them. So lookouts. Lookouts watch out for any changes in fire behavior. Lookouts should generally be all leaders, and any aircraft on a fire should be a lookout. They should be watching the fire, not just watching head down working. Should be looking out at the fire. When topography allows, you can post somebody to watch the fire, especially if you've got topography and you've got high ground. Particularly important in the interface if you're working remote from the fire. If you're close to the fire, maybe you can watch it. But if you're setting up sprinklers and working and the fire's a long ways off and you can't see it, you're more in danger, and lookout's more important because you can't see the fire. You might not be as cognizant of what's happening. We did have aircraft. One thing I did think afterwards, after our fire in Hilo recently, is that we could have, if manpower allowing too, we could have done with leaving a lookout up on the hill where we initially had our incident command post. As the fire progressed, we couldn't see the fire from there, and we had to move our command post, but it might have been a good spot to leave a lookout. Anyway, so the lookouts, and again, as a default, it's going to be all supervisors. Anchor points. An anchor point means that we start our fire line, making our fire from a safety zone, from a safe place. We'll talk about safety zones, but so that's anchoring. And it generates the risk management. When head fire intensity is over 3, then we say we must anchor. That's what forestry says. If it's less than 3, you should anchor. It's a good idea to anchor, but it's not necessarily mandatory. An example of not anchoring would be walking out into a grassy field to a grass fire. Well, when you've left the road and you're walking, say you walk 100 meters or so across that field, you haven't anchored. And if the fire turns and runs, then you could be trapped. So again, if it's a low intensity fire, low rank, fire behavior is not so bad, it doesn't matter so much. It's not as important, and might not be mandatory, but it's always a good idea. So the communication side. So communication, remember what I said about the first aid kit in the water. A structure fire, vehicle fire, whatever, we're close. But when you get in a wildland fire, people can be a long ways away. And so you don't have visual, and you can't yell by voice. So it's important that you have communications with all people at all times. It's part of accountability, but also that lookout. If you can't communicate the changes that you're seeing, then what's the point? So you have to have communications with all people at all times. And it's critical to communicate those changes in fire behavior, especially for the need to access safety zones. An escape route is how you're going to get to your safety zone. Very often the hose line or the dozer guard is an escape route to get to your safety zone. And safety zones, the last one is most important. So key element of LACES is a safe area. And I often say, if you don't only remember two of these, remember communications and safety zones, right? Because the lookouts are kind of tied into your communication. The anchor points and escape routes are all about starting from or getting to a safety zone. So a safety zone is simply a safe area where it should be able to survive the passage of a fire. So it's a safe area that's not going to burn, essentially, or not going to burn very intensely. Very commonly, we'll say the black. We talked about that already. The black can be a good safety zone, especially if you're dealing with grass, a grass fire. When we're dealing with conifer, you have to be careful. If it's all burnt, that's great. But sometimes you just get a surface fire that goes through, and it's actually dried out the crown fuels and ladder fuels so that it can burn again and closer to burning because it's already dried out. So make sure you get, so we'll say good black. If you have good black, that's a very good safety zone. It could be man-made structures such as a well site or a road or a parking lot, a field, especially if it's plowed or if it's grazed pasture. These can be good safety zones. A wet area, open rock, not so much in this country, more in the mountains or the Canadian Shield, could be a safety zone. One thing, when it comes to the size of a safety zone, how big does it have to be? Sometimes they'll say generally 2 to 4 flame lengths. So you can see for grass, it could be very small. For something like black spruce, it could be very large. Another thing I didn't do very well as incident commander, and how well it's communicated to crews, are LACES on that recent fire we had in Hilo, because my thinking was, and again, I didn't communicate it. I don't know if crew leaders were communicating it. I should have taken more effort to communicate it. But our safety zones there, yeah, we had the black in the grass, but for a lot of it, especially when we were defensive, it was any area on that road, that 165, that wasn't bordered by spruce. So if you're in an area of that road that's bordered by spruce and it gets too hot, and you can go to an area that's bordered by grass, because you've got the road and the road right of way, we would have considered that a safety zone. So safety zones are key to knowing where your safety zones are, and being cognizant too that working on a wildfire, you may cover a lot of miles, a lot of distance in one day, in one shift. So your safety zones may change, and you have to be aware of that at all times. You may also have a primary and a secondary. Maybe you've got a really good safety zone, but that's several hundred meters away. In that case, I want a secondary safety zone that I can get to in 3 steps. So keep that in mind. And very important, again, I kind of dropped the ball a bit in our last fire. It's very important for leaders, supervisors, IC, to communicate that and make sure it's communicated to the crew so they know. So again, we're not 100%. Firefighters still die in Canada. In the States, we talk about wildland fire behavior. They have a lot of things stacked against them when it comes to fuels and weather. But our focus in Canada has really been on knowing and following LACES to avoid entrapment. And we haven't, knock on wood, had any of those mass casualty incidents where we get a whole crew overrun by fire, and they've been somewhat limited. Not to be lackadaisical or think we're immune, but just the importance of LACES, particularly having those safety zones. All right, well, I've covered a lot of ground today, and it's unfortunate, not unfortunate, which is a new method we're trying, so I can't see you, can't hear you, not a lot of interaction. But just to recap, we're not expecting, there's no test, there's no certification from this. It's just knowledge. And particularly, I know when Chris Clark requested this for the peace officers, I'm hoping that the peace officers that have participated, just so you're a bit more in the know of what's going on, because it can be frightening, it can be intimidating, it can be dangerous when you don't know what's going on. So maybe we're not expecting you to carry out these tasks. So again, I know our peace officers can be very hands-on and do a lot of help for us. But I hope by getting a little bit more understanding of wildland fire behavior and how it is we fight wildfires and wildfire safety, that's going to help you with your jobs. And for those on the fire department that have been doing this for a long time, it's always good to refresh ourselves on this. And for those that are just learning, again, you'll learn through exposure and you'll hear it multiple times. But tonight was one way to do that. So I'll open up to any questions now. I say have fun and stay safe. I'm always careful that, well, I don't want a fire to happen. Nobody wants a fire to happen. They're destructive. They hurt people. but we want you to have fun when we're doing them. I want our work to be fun, but most importantly, we want you to stay safe. So I think I can close this now and open it up to any questions that anybody has. I see Brad's smiling face there. Put my camera back on. I always apologize on my computer because it looks like I'm looking down my nose. That's two things. The cord for my camera is not long enough to reach the top, my monitor, and my bifocals. So I literally am looking down my nose. So does anyone have any questions?
It's pretty quiet out there. Yeah, if anybody's got questions, speak up.
And that's fine. You know, I want to keep to 90 minutes, and that's what we've done. I'm available. I'm always available if you have any questions about the training or anything else from Wildland that I might be able to help you with. Again, I've given you some reading recommendations. Anyone wants more of those, I can certainly give them. There's a lot of information out there. I just wanted to get you started with that. And Brad brought this up, either Chris or I. Chris, I hope you've recorded it anyway, so we can get the participants, and we'll do a headquarters training report for the firefighters. All right, so I'll mute it again. Anyone has anything else?
Dave, it's Clinton. Just wanted to say good job. It definitely helps. I think that we've already talked about this before, about making sure that we all kind of communicate and get on kind of one channel where we can all kind of make sure that everyone's aware of everything so that we can assist in a more positive role if need be, and kind of help that way. But I think that the communication is definitely getting better. And I think that once we kind of get that down pat and everything else, I think that the team, both on your end and our end, can do a much better job. And way to go, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Clinton. And yeah, didn't spend a ton of time talking about the communication side because we've got a lot to cover. But when it comes to radios and sharing frequencies, that is important. But I think even just again helping the peace officers to understand some of the terminology and what we're talking about, hopefully that will help our communications as well. So thanks for the feedback, Clinton. Good.
Yeah, no worries. I know now that I have to say bush instead of forest, even though I don't like the bush.
No comment.
I just want to throw out a thanks there for Dave and for hosting for tonight, and really for everybody coming out. First time we've hosted something like this. I think it's gone over fairly well. As we mentioned, it was recording, so I'll figure out how to share this tomorrow, so we can share it out for anyone who wants to watch it again, and anybody who wasn't able to attend. And just a reminder, just in terms of some other training opportunities, next Wednesday we're back again, same time. Dave's going to cover off Dozer Boss operations, kind of a summary of that orientation. Also, in the past, we've sent out, Ag and Forestry has a lot of online training opportunities that are free. So I'll have a look for that email and I can resend it if anybody's interested. Plus, we've got lots of various online training. I know within the fire Moodle classrooms, if anybody's looking at doing anything. And the last note I had here, it's already been said, but yes, there will be an FB2. I'll get that created tomorrow for all the fire. But anybody else have any questions here before we sign off for the night? All right, looks like that's it. So yeah, thanks, Dave, and thanks everybody for tonight. That went well.
Great, yeah, and Rita too. I want to say thank you. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for attending, and we'll see you at the next call.